we're going to expose the biggest bait and switch in modern real estate. I know, I'm not talking about condos with city views that face a parking garage. I'm talking about tiny homes. The ones all over your feed, all over Netflix, all over Airbnb. And we're breaking down why they blew up after the 2008 crash. Why they went from civil disobedience to Instagram aesthetics. And why that affordable 200 square foot dream box might come with built-in code loopholes. No legal place to park it. And a per square foot price that'll make your eyes water. You're not ready for what's next. But before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video. What does a global financial meltdown have to do with you watching a 26-year-old make pour over coffee in a 100 square foot box on wheels? More than you think. Take yourself back to 2008. Banks are collapsing, people are losing houses they never should have been sold. And an entire generation is watching their parents get absolutely wiped out by mortgages. That trauma is stuck. So when a guy named Jay Schaefer had already been out there since the late 90s saying, hey, what if your whole house was 12 by 8 feet and you just didn't own anything? That idea was sitting in the back of people's minds like a sleeper agent, just waiting for the right moment to activate it. But here's the catch. Schaefer wasn't selling affordability. He was selling rebellion. His whole thing was that building codes were bloated, that you didn't need 2,000 square feet to live a decent life, and that a tiny well-built space was just as real and legitimate as any suburban ranch house. It was civil disobedience with a cute loft bed. The problem is that after 2008, millions of people grabbed that idea, stripped out all the philosophy and kept only the price tag. Picture this. You're 28 years old. You watched your parents lose their house. You got student loans eating you alive, and a starter home in your city costs 400 grand. And then someone on YouTube shows you a $60,000 tiny house on wheels and says that you could own this outright. No banking loans, no 30-year sentence, just yours. Of course it sounds insane. Of course you click. And the math felt real at first. No mortgage, no HOA fees. You can heat a tiny space for almost nothing. And then the environmental pitch got layered on top of that. Smaller home, smaller footprint, good for the planet. It all stacked into this neat little package that felt like the system finally had a back door. And you just found that key. But here's what nobody tells you. Tiny houses on wheels are not technically houses. They're classified more like RVs or trailers in most places. And that's exactly how they dodge building codes. Sounds like a win, right? Except that also means that they dodge the protections and infrastructure that make a house actually livable long term. Things like minimum safety standards, proper insulation, utility hookups that just work. So you've got this thing that looks like a house, costs like a car, but legally exists in this grey area between a camper and a garden shed. And in the post-2008 desperation to own literally anything, a lot of people just gloss right over these things. Let that sink in for you. The early adopters, the ones who actually read Schaefer's work, they knew what they were signing up for. They wanted the experiment. They wanted the lifestyle reset. But the wave of people that came after 2008, they wanted out of the housing market, and these tiny homes looked like the exit door. Those are two very different motivations, and they lead to very different outcomes. The housing crash, it didn't just wreck the market, it wrecked people's trust in the whole idea of a traditional mortgage. Tiny homes didn't blow up because they were a smart financial move. They blew up because they were the only move that felt safe to a generation that watched debt destroy everything that their parents had built. And that's not housing revolution. That's trauma with good lighting. And once that emotional hook was set, it only took one more ingredient to turn a fringe experiment into a full-blown industry. And that ingredient came with a ring light and an Airbnb listing. So here's where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean slightly unhinged. Tiny homes went from stick it to the man architecture to the highest earning unique property type in all of Airbnb. That is not a small shift. That is a complete identity transplant. By the mid-2000s, Netflix and HGTV had figured out that tiny homes were basically perfect TV. Small spaces, big personalities, dramatic before and afters. Tiny house nations dropped dramatically in 2019, and suddenly everyone's end was texting these people links. The aesthetic got locked in fast. Shiplap walls, Edison bulbs, a little deck with string lights, a loft that you need a little ladder to reach. It looked incredible on the screens, right? It looked incredible on Instagram. And that's exactly the problem. Because once something looks incredible on Instagram, it stops being a lifestyle and starts actually being a product. The people building these tiny homes stopped asking, does this work for daily living? And started asking, does this photograph well? And the people booking them stopped asking, can I actually shower in here? Started asking also, will this get me likes? The original ethos, frugality, simplicity, civil disobedience, got completely steamrolled by aesthetics. One real estate development called Tiny Homes tailor-made Airbnb bait. And honestly, he ain't wrong. Here's the number that tells the whole story. In 2021, tiny homes were the highest grossing unique space on airtime, and Airbnb pulling in $195 million for their hosts. They're not tree houses, not boats, tiny homes. Because people will pay a premium to pay a weekend to live in one, even though they actually never do it full time. And that gap between the fantasy and the reality is where all the money lives. So smart investors looked at the data and realized that tiny homes were not a housing solution. They were a hospitality product. You build one for 80 grand, stick it on a piece of land, list it on Airbnb, and you're suddenly pulling in more per night than regular rentals get per week. Why deal with a long-term tenant when you can rent to a couple from the city who just want to experience tiny living for a long weekend and leave you a 5-star review in return? And this is where the bait and switch really kicks in. The whole cultural conversation kept on using words like affordable and accessible and housing solutions. But the actual money was flowing in exactly the opposite direction, towards short-term luxury rentals for people who already had homes. The people who actually needed affordable housing weren't the ones booking these Airbnbs. Let that sink in for you. But here's what no one tells you about the per square foot math. We're talking $450 per square foot on a lot of these tricked out tiny homes on wheels. A median US home runs closer to $150 per square foot. So the affordable tiny home is actually way more expensive per square foot than a regular house. It's just cheaper in total because it's tiny. That's not affordability. That's just smallness. And then there's the parking problem, which shockingly never comes up on the Instagram videos. You got a house on wheels. Magic, right? Great. Where does it go though? Most residential zones will not allow it. One couple actually documented moving their tiny home from Toronto to Philadelphia, and that move alone cost them $4,000. Just the move. Not the land, not the hookups, just rolling this thing down the highway. The movement got financialized. Someone looked at the Instagram aesthetic and the emotional appeal and the Airbnb demand and said, this is a product. And they were right. The Freedom tiny homes were supposed to represent God-free packages and then sold back to you at $250 a night. But here's the thing. Tiny homes are not a scam, but they're not a revolution either. They're a product that got really good at looking like a philosophy. Even Jay Shaper, the guy who basically started all this, said it himself. That a lot of parasites ending up attaching themselves to this movement, trying to make money off it. The people who actually thrive in tiny homes went in with eyes open. They knew about the zoning fines, the $4,000 tow bills, the per square foot math, and they made the peace with all of it. But the people that got burned, they bought the Instagram version and skipped the fine print. So before you start pricing up shiplap and loft ladders, ask yourself one honest question. Are you buying a home or are you buying a vibe? Those are two very different purchases with very different price tags. Drop buying a home or buying a vibe in the comments, because I genuinely want to know what your thoughts are on this. And if this video just saved you from a 90-gram mistake, make sure to hit that subscribe, because next week we're getting into ADIOS, and I promise the plot twist on those is just as good. See you on the next one.